Greetings, I'm Professor K, and in this short video presentation, we're going to take a look at how we go about preparing our network for Active Directory. For this lab, I will be using one install of the latest version of VirtualBox along with the extension pack, one virtual install of Server 2016, and one virtual install of Windows 10 capable of joining a domain. Now, what does that mean? That means that your version of Windows 10 must be either Pro or Enterprise. You cannot join a domain with the home version or any other version of Windows 10. Most small to medium-sized networks are going to be built using the single domain model. Everything is going to be built with a single root domain controller, in our case, Server 2016, and that will be the primary domain controller up on the domain. Any other domain controllers that come after the root domain controller are referred to as replicas. So the naming of your domain should not be taken lightly, especially if it's going to be a production network or a production domain, and it's expected to have a life expectancy of somewhere between 5 and 7 years. That being the case, you should not name your domain based on something that will change or become outdated. This includes naming your domain after a product line, operating system, or anything likely to change over time. Stick with something that will make sense 5 or even 7 years down the road. Secondly, you want to stick with short names of 15 characters or less. This will allow legacy devices to be able to find devices on the domain and allow those devices to communicate with other devices on that same network. Every device on your domain will have two names: a fully qualified domain name, or a FQDN, and a NetBIOS name. Some older operating systems and software use NetBIOS names to locate each other on the network. The name you choose for your internal private network can reflect your internet presence. For instance, if you sell products or services on the internet and your registered domain name is cyberoffense.com, well, your internal network can also be called something related to cyberoffense.com, and that would be something we call a subdomain. So that subdomain could be something that is based on location. It could be job description. It could be a product line. It can be a lot of different things. In this example, I'm going to name my domain internally us.cyberoffense.com. That subdomain is not registered on the internet, and therefore it cannot be found, and it shouldn't be found. I'm only interested in my internet presence being cyberoffense.com, not my internal network. The two primary naming conventions for a subdomain are either location or function. So you could call your domain internally lab.whatever.com, or you could call it Tucson.whatever the name of your domain is.com. An example of that would be Tucson.cyberoffense.com. That would be the location of where my network internally is located. But I can also call it us.cyberoffense.com, referring to the fact that I have a location inside of the United States where my cyberoffense.com network is actually located. So you want to choose your subdomain carefully. Make sure any naming convention that you come up with, you run it by the management and ensure that they agree that this is a good name for your internal network. The second part of any naming convention deals with how you will identify devices on your network. By default, Microsoft will give each host on the network a unique name, but this name is not conducive to good network management, nor does it ease having to find and troubleshoot problem devices. An example of this would be that when I created this server, Microsoft assigned to it a default name. Now you look at the default name and you can see that it makes no sense. I don't know if it's a Windows workstation, if it's a server, or what it is. So I'm going to give this machine a user-friendly name, but I'm also going to ensure that I try to keep that name as short as possible, because its fully qualified domain name will also include the name of the domain. So all of my domain controllers begin with DC. So my first domain controller, which will be the root, will be called DC1. The replicas start with DC2, 3, and 4, and so on. So when I see that name on the network, DC, I know that I'm looking at a domain controller for my domain. Now, the next important thing that you have to know about building a domain or a network is having the correct IP addressing scheme. Machines that need to be found all the time, such as routers, firewalls, printers, servers, those devices all need to be statically configured. So you want to make sure that those IP addresses are reserved for those devices. So you want to make sure that when you design your IP scheme, that you design it so that you have reserved certain blocks of IP addresses for certain devices. As we look at this table, you'll see that I have a network IP address of 192.168.145.0. I have a subnet mask of 255.255.255.0, and that's going to give me approximately 254 IP addresses that I can use for my domain. I have assigned the first IP address to my default gateway, which is going to be the inside interface of either my router or my firewall. And normally, under most circumstances, that's going to have an IP address for the host of 1. It doesn't have to be that way. Some people like to use 254. Some people like to use .2. I like to use .1. All other networking devices, such as an IDS or a switch, I have reserved the IP address block starting at .2 all the way up to .9. For my servers, I have reserved a block of IP addresses starting at .10 all the way up to .19. For my printers, I have reserved a block of IP addresses from .20 all the way up to .29. And that brings us to our host, which is going to be the biggest block of IP addresses that I'm going to need for this domain. For my host machines, for my workstations, I have reserved a block of IP addresses starting at .30 all the way up to .199. That leaves me approximately 54 IP addresses that are not being used. And I'm going to keep those in case I need them for anything else. So if I need to increase any block of IP addresses, I have a reserve of 54 that I can pull from and add to that particular block. So in this short video presentation, you got to learn about the importance of choosing a good naming convention for your domain. We also looked at some of the ways we can prevent issues with our naming convention. And we also got to look at how we go about designing an IP addressing scheme for our network. And remember that any device that needs to be readily available on the network needs to be configured with a static IP address. And these include firewalls, switches, servers, and printers, but there are other devices as well. If you have any questions or concerns about anything that was presented to you in this short video, please do not hesitate to reach out, contact your instructor, and I'll see you in my next video.